conversation. We're so pleased today to be joined by our friend here in New York, Jason Friedman, former prosecutor. There's a mouthful, right, Jason? Yes. Former prosecutor joining us today. And Robert Johnson, who's a criminal defense attorney, joins us down in Conway, South Carolina. Let me ask you gentlemen both first about Bambi Bennett. And I guess I'll start with my criminal defense attorney, but then I think, Jason, you can shed some interesting light as a former prosecutor. How about the fact that this woman, once arrested, once a suspect, in fact, first a suspect in this case before attention turned to the current defendant, Richard Gagnon, now is a witness for the prosecution, is no longer subject to trial. She could be prosecuted going forward, of course, but what do you make of that? What does it say to you about the strength or relative weakness of the prosecution's case? Please, go ahead in South Carolina.
As far as her being called as a witness?
As far as the prosecution originally charging her, then choosing to drop the charges, and now going forward against only Richard Gagnon, does that suggest to you a strong case or a relatively weak case?
Well, from what I understand, this case is purely circumstantial, so they're going to call any witnesses they possibly can. They originally arrested her based on probable cause, which is a very minimal standard. They've dismissed the case against her because they simply don't feel that they have enough evidence to prosecute her, which is a much stronger standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt.
But does it say anything to you, Robert, about the relative strength or weakness of the case against Richard Gagnon?
Well, any case that's purely circumstantial is going to be a difficult case for the prosecution. So I believe that it's probably closer to weakness than it is strength, and they're going to call any witness they possibly can.
All right, including Bambi Bennett. We're going to talk a lot more about how she factors into the case in a moment. Jason, let me come over to you. What do you think? It is a purely circumstantial case, but prosecutors like yourself always say to me, look, circumstantial case doesn't have to be a weak case. You can have a mountain of circumstantial evidence. What do you see here, mountain or molehill?
It's tough to make that assessment right now. Certainly they're going to call many witnesses as possible, put as much evidence forward as possible to make the strongest possible circumstantial case. With respect to Bambi, it's my understanding that some forensic evidence didn't exactly pan out, and therefore the prosecutor had no choice but to drop the charges against her. He felt, or she felt, that they would be unable to meet the burden of proof required at trial in order to convict her beyond a reasonable doubt.
All right, we're going to come back at you on the other side of this and ask, against both was weak. Shouldn't both remain charged, or both perhaps have their charges dismissed? My friend, the prosecutor, is with us today. Jason, what do you think?
It's a very simple answer, Jamie, and that is the prosecution clearly feels that they'll be able to meet the required burden of proof against Mr. Gagnon, but not against Ms. Bennett. And they have an ethical obligation at that point to drop charges against somebody that they don't believe in good faith they can carry the burden of proof for.
All right, Jennifer, let me come out to you, I guess, into the conversation. And I think first I will come to New York and Jason Friedman, because, Jason, when we lose our feed to the courtroom, we also lose our feed to our South Carolina guest, but it's better for you, our former prosecutor. So this is what crime scene analysts do. They go back to the crime scene and try to help the prosecution, and you are a former prosecutor, figure out what went on. And in a ballistics case, you would think it would be pretty straightforward, but I think the defense is suggesting that it's not always straightforward, and that to some extent, crime scene analysis is an art as much as it is a science.
There's no question about it, and that's why the defense attorneys, and especially in a circumstantial case, spend a lot of time with the crime scene investigators on the witness stand, in part to discredit them. Maybe they weren't careful in collecting the evidence. Maybe they didn't follow protocol in collecting the evidence. You want to poke holes in the credibility of the crime scene detectives. The second thing that the defense attorney will want to do, as the defense attorney in this case just did, and that is suggest to the crime scene investigator other possible explanations for the forensic evidence that was indeed found.
Here's what I was so engrossed in as we went to black. They talk about, and we heard Jennifer London report, this is a very grisly crime scene. One of the men who discovered the bodies of the Parkers, Charlie Parker Sr. and his wife Diane, testified Monday, and this is a man who goes to crime scenes, Jason, for a living. He said the scene was like a horror movie with blood everywhere. Now, let's let me ask you about that, because we generally think of knifings and other sorts of hands-on violence as being the most horrific and leaving the most violent of crime scenes. But anyone who's been to a scene like this, where people have been shot to death, comes to see that ballistics and bullets and guns can do the same kind of bloody damage. It's not a clean wound every time, right?
No question about it. A 9mm handgun can cause horrific damage to the body. It all depends on how many shots were fired, the location of the shots, where they entered the body, and of course the distance that they were fired from can make an absolutely grisly crime scene from gunshots. Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is what's fascinating as I look at the defense. Jason, how about it? You know, our style here in New York is, I always bring up Bruce Cutler, which is the most extreme example that you can come up with, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney. He has a very in-your-face style. But we go all around the country with our cameras here, and sometimes we see this style down south, very genteel, very polite, but I think it's working.
Oh, no doubt about it that it's working. And you have to remember that this witness is not being belligerent, not being evasive, not being a difficult witness, and therefore there's no real reason to be aggressive with this particular witness. I'm sure if Mr. Grammer felt that the witness was being evasive or difficult, he would get a little more aggressive in the cross-examination, and maybe he's saving that for another witness
yeah,
who's
you
not going to
think
be
so,
as
huh?
cooperative.
I get the same feeling that he's got a little fire in his belly there. So you're right, a very important witness, and a long day on the witness stand today. Let's bring our guest back into the conversation. Jason Friedman here with me in New York, former prosecutor Robert Johnson, criminal defense attorney. And, you know, I've been throwing it to the defense attorney all morning first, so let's be fair. Let me jump over to the former prosecutor. On balance, how do you think this witness did for your side of this case, John Calder, the crime scene investigator and analyst?
I think the witness did very well as for the prosecution. There's always going to be a couple of things that can be second-guessed in terms of what particular forensic evidence was gathered, as well as the conclusions that were drawn from the forensic evidence. But I think overall this witness was very, very credible, seems to really know what he's doing, and I think his testimony was received very well from what I could tell.
All right, Rob.